In September 2023, David Morgan and I believe Dan Burston, in association with the British Psychoanalytic Journal Free Associations, together with the Freud Museum, put on a conference called Authoritarianism in all its guises, left, right, and center. And now the book has come out, edited by Dan Burston and Kurt Jacobson. Here it is, Authoritarianism in all its guises, left, right, and center. Excellent collection of papers, proud to say, including one of mine, Chapter 2, Superego, Our Inner Authoritarian, is the chapter I wrote for this book. We're actually having a little book launch this afternoon, and I'm going to say a few words. Well, if you're interested, you can read my chapter. I'm not going to just repeat myself today because, that was September 2023. It's now late April 2025. A lot has happened. So I'm not revising, but I'm expanding on what I have to say in that chapter. So it was in 1923, in The Ego and the Id, that Freud presented his structural theory, id, ego, and superego, a three-partite model of the mind, very much echoing Plato's division of the soul into three parts: appetite, roughly id, reason, roughly ego, and spirit, which in some ways resemble superego. So we have this three-part theory of the mind. We came to associate, unfortunately, in mainstream psychoanalytic thinking, the id for Freud was the repository of the sexual and aggressive drives, and the sexuality was thought of as fairly, polymorphous perverse, fairly asocial or antisocial. So the id as a whole came to be thought of as the source of the antisocial in human beings. Ego, the seat of reason. Superego came to be thought of, especially by the social scientists, as internalized social morality. Now, that was not true to Freud. Freud himself understood that the engine of the superego was id aggression turned back against the self, id hostility turned back against the self, plus secondarily the internalization of the social norms. But the id aggression element of the superego was lost sight of by social scientists. And so the superego came to be thought of as entirely a socially constructed phenomenon. In any case, this model came widely to be sort of understood as the id as the antisocial, the superego as the pro-social, and the ego reason and rationality. What was lost sight of in all of this was the pro-social aspect of the id, because the id contained sexual and aggressive drives. After 1920, Freud is speaking of eros and thanatos. Now, eros for Freud is not just sex. It's a drive to connect. It's a drive to attach. It's about relating and relationship. So the pro-social id would contain eros, would contain a pro-social drive for attachment and connection and relatedness. And this was kind of lost sight of in conventional psychodynamic thinking. The id came to be thought of as the animal part of man and as beastly, as antisocial. Meanwhile, the superego was considered largely to be the good guy, the source of morality, thus obscuring the antisocial superego. So the pro-social id and the antisocial superego. I mean, psychoanalysts seem to forget, Freud never fully seemed to recognize that the superego, of course, as internalized culture, is internalized racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, commodity fetishism. Psychoanalysis lost sight of the antisocial superego and the pro-social id. Okay, in my article, it's entitled Superego, Our Inner Authoritarian. If we follow Freud, the superego is formed at the end of the Oedipal phase. The little boy's Oedipal project of having mommy and getting rid of daddy is generating so much anxiety and guilt because if he has reached the stage of ambivalence, he both loves and hates daddy, his arrival, and it's very uncomfortable hating somebody you love, wanting to get rid of the guy who takes you to the ball game or teaches you how to ride a bike. So there's guilt, there's anxiety, father might exact a terrible revenge. So this whole project is overwhelming and futile, and the little boy gives up. He knuckles under. He says, okay, Dad, she's yours. I'll get one of my own one day. And the hostility towards the father as a rival is turned against the self. It's too dangerous to deploy it towards the father, so it is turned on the self. Things are more complicated in the case of the female, but still, she does get a superego. I'm not going to enter into the whole debate about how Freud, thought that the female winds up with a weaker superego. There are real flaws in that theory. Often her superego is even more harsh because boys are encouraged to vent their aggression out. Girls are discouraged from venting hostility out, and so there's even more pressure to turn it back against the self. In any case, males and females wind up with aggression turned on self, and that is the essence of the superego. That's what the superego is, aggression turned on self, plus the internalization of social and cultural norms and values, internalizing the superego of the parents. Okay, this aggression turned on the self, this is the internalization of parental authority. It's the internalization of social authority. It's an inner regulator. It's an inner authoritarian. Freud had inconsistent views of the superego. In his sociological work, like Civilization and Its Discontents, he represents it as something like a good cop, saving us from and saving society, civilization, from the antisocial id. In order to live a civilized life, we have to inhibit the antisocial drives of the id. He's not mentioning anything about the pro-social drives of the id, but the antisocial drives have to be inhibited. If they're acted out, civilized order breaks down. So the superego preserves society, preserves social order by turning the aggression back against the self. So we have this inner cop who serves society. Okay. But in his clinical work, Freud is describing the superego very differently. It's not a good cop preserving society. It's really rather a perverse bad cop who at times even tempts us to sin so it can punish us. What it really wants to do is whip us. Freud is describing the superego in his clinical work as tyrannical, sadistic, harsh, cruel. As time goes on, his description of the superego is more and more tyrannical and severe and punitive. In fact, in his later work, really the superego is the center of psychopathology. This is the origin of punitive guilt, persecutory guilt, self-sabotage, suicide. The essence of pathology, and therefore the clinical process of psychoanalysis, is more and more depicted as a struggle with this, what Fairbairn called the internal saboteur. A contradiction then between Freud's clinical recognition of the superego as the source of pathology, as an inner bully, and his sociological work. So the many different forms of pathology involving the superego. On the one hand, we have neurosis, where the drives of the id, both pro-social and antisocial, can be targeted. Superego disapproves, and the drives are repressed, sometimes projected outwards, split off, repressed. And then, of course, we have the inevitable disguised return of the repressed, which is the essence of neurotic symptomatology. Another pattern of pathology would involve not so much the repression of the id as the repression of the superego, the silencing of the superego. And of course, I make a distinction between conscience and superego. In the pattern I'm describing now, both conscience and superego would be somehow split off. And so the person is acting out in an antisocial way, to the point of different degrees even of psychopathy. It was the great Leo Rangel who, at a time when guilt was being evaded in both society and in psychoanalysis, Rangel was not caught up in that guilt evasion. He wrote a book called The Mind of Watergate. He was discharged from the U.S. Army at the end of the war. He moved to California, and he started watching Dick Nixon, whom he quickly recognized as a sociopath. And he was fascinated with how this sociopath was prospering politically, perhaps because of his recognizable sociopathy. Rangel was interested in the fact that large sections of society seemed to be willing to vote for what looked like successful psychopaths. And so he was watching Nixon, and after the Watergate crisis, he produced this book called The Mind of Watergate. The subtitle was Notes on the Syndrome of the Compromise of Integrity, the syndrome of compromise of integrity. And he made a very simple point that seemed to have been neglected. Ego defenses can be directed against the antisocial id, but ego defenses can also be directed against the superego. And that is the syndrome of compromise of integrity. I would expand that and say that ego defenses can be directed against both superego and against conscience. I won't go into that distinction. I have plenty of videos on my channel here that goes into that distinction between superego and conscience. But for the point today is that ego defenses can be directed against the id, but also against both superego and conscience, putting conscience and superego out of commission. This would result in what Reid Malloy, psychoanalyst, sort of expert in the area of psychopathy, he would say this is the neurotic psychopath. Of course, he posits what he calls the primary psychopath, and he cites the twin studies that show that there is this kind of primary psychopathy which has 50% heritability in the twin studies. It's a biological basis. These people have extraordinarily high pain tolerance and a whole series of biologically recognized traits. Okay, I'm not talking about the primary psychopath, I'm talking about the secondary psychopath. The secondary psychopath depends on ego defenses against superego and conscience to put it out of commission. I've argued that in society for decades we have been evading guilt and therefore psychoanalysis since about 1950 or 60 has been evading guilt. Carveth said guilty man is a thing of the past. We moved into the age of tragic man. Underneath tragic man, I mean, on the surface there is such a difference, certainly, but in the analysis of tragic man, in the analysis of the narcissistic personality of our time, in the analysis of self-disorders, eventually you get down to the guilty man underneath the tragic man. He's well buried, but if the analysis proceeds, he will come out and get analyzed, okay? But there's been this flight from guilt. Certainly in society, neoliberal capitalism doesn't want to hear from regulators, doesn't want to hear from superego or conscience. Ayn Rand, selfishness is good, no need for regulators. Okay, psychoanalysis, even while studying the narcissistic personalities, is itself evading guilt. It's not studying the role of the superego or the conscience in narcissism. It's seeing narcissism purely as a result of environmental failure, trauma, deprivation at the beginning. No attention to the role of superego in these conditions. But there was Rangel, sticking to his guns, understanding the role of ego defenses against superego in what he called the syndrome of the compromise of integrity. Okay, well, so that's a second pattern of psychopathology. I spoke first about neurosis, people who repress the id and the superego becomes dominant. There is repression of the id, resulting in those compromised formations that make up neurotic symptomatology. Second pattern is the defenses are directed not against the id, but against the superego, and I would include the conscience. And we have the syndrome of the compromise of integrity. We have the neurotic psychopath. We have the mind of Watergate. There's a third pattern that I wrote of about a few years ago for another British Psychoanalytic Society conference. the title of that paper was Marching Under the Banner of the Superego. One way of defending yourself against the harsh superego is to join it, to identify with it, to become the superego and deploy its hostility towards others rather than towards oneself. That's the scapegoating mechanism. And of course, here I was referring to the authoritarianism of the left. I was referring to woke authoritarianism. And my motto in that paper was, let the woke who are not authoritarian call out the woke who are. It's as if the woke came to recognize racism is bad, sexism is bad, heterosexism is bad, blah, 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 classism is bad. They seem to fail to recognize that authoritarianism is bad. And they became authoritarian. And we had cancel culture. And of course, this authoritarian, I'm not going to say of the left, because that to me is not left. That's identity politics. The left is anti-capitalism. And that, after the Occupy Wall Street, which was an anti-capitalist movement, the anti-capitalism sort of fell to the wayside, and we have nothing but identity politics, which is a huge mistake. In any case, we had this authoritarian version of wokeness, and of course, it set us up for a terrible backlash, which is what we're living in now. Authoritarianism of the left gives rise to, appears to justify, the authoritarianism of the right. So now we have Donald Trump and Elon Musk and people being sent to El Salvador and the Supreme Court being defied, creeping fascism. I would say it isn't creeping so much anymore. It's getting to be outright fascism. And I blame the authoritarian woke pseudo-left partly for this. Of course, this right-wing authoritarianism has always been lurking, but people got so fed up with authoritarian wokeness that it strengthened the authoritarianism of the right, and now we're in this terrible mess, which is to some extent the fault of left authoritarianism. Authoritarianism, right, left, and center. I mean, authoritarianism is bad in and of itself, wherever you find it. I'm a Democrat. I celebrate democracy, free speech, habeas corpus, the rule of law, innocent until proven guilty, etc. The American constitutional system of the separation of powers, countervailing powers, the presidency, the Supreme Court, the Congress, the Senate, the free press, balancing one another. Brilliant, brilliant idea. It's broken down or breaking down at the moment. I hope it can be put right. There is talk apparently in the Wall Street Journal today. A journalist is calling for impeachment of Donald Trump because even the billionaires are running scared. They realize he's just wrecking the economy that made them rich. They may not so much be worried about democracy as they are about their bank accounts. But meanwhile, democratic forces within the U.S. are building. Some very admirable judges are beginning to stand up. So I think there's grounds for some hope when people who care about democracy link up with powerful people who care about their bank accounts, then maybe something will happen. Meanwhile, here in Canada, we're in the middle of an election. And we have a tremendous new liberal leader um, who appears to be way ahead in the polls at the moment. It looks like that Carney might form a majority government here in a few weeks' time. Um, for the first time, I have a sign in front of my house. As a psychoanalyst, I felt I shouldn't have political signs. I should maintain an appearance of neutrality. I always felt, but I've changed because I never felt that democracy was under threat of fascism here in North America before. There's no time for neutrality. So I got a Carney sign out in front of my house, and yesterday I voted. The advanced polling opened yesterday. So there are grounds for hope. But here is this book now out, Authoritarianism, Left, Right, and Center. My chapter, The Superego, Our Inner Authoritarian. And the three ways that we can deal with this inner authoritarian, we can allow it to cause us to repress our drives and become neurotic. We can identify with it and target others and develop what Heinrich Racker called a mania for reproaching, authoritarian wokeness. Or we can direct offenses against both superego and conscience and become neurotic psychopaths. And so here we are, the authoritarianism on the left, giving rise to this authoritarian backlash on the right. But maybe we can begin now to resist all three of these forms of psychopathology, different ways of dealing with the superego. Maybe we can learn how to develop an ego that has enough strength, ego strength, to stand up to the bully, superego, without enacting it, without caving in the face of it, without repressing it, so that we can become reasonable and conscientious people and rebuild the democratic structures that at the present time are being torn down. Okay.